Every week, Surfing the MASH Tsunami brings you 3 major stories from the world of steatotic liver disease. This weekend, we are bringing you each of those stories separately so you can listen during a shorter, discrete period of time. Hope you enjoy them.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This weekend, we are sharing the 3 main sections from our episode 3. Roger will provide more information after these notes from our sponsors.
Surfing the MASH Tsunami is sponsored by these healthcare-related organizations.
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Inc. is a biopharmaceutical company focused on delivering novel therapeutics for metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, or MASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's medication, Rezdiffra, resmetirom, is a once-daily oral liver-directed THR beta agonist designed to target key underlying causes of MASH. Rezdiffra is the first and only medication approved by the FDA for the treatment of MASH with moderate to advanced fibrosis, consistent with stages F2 to F3. An ongoing Phase 3 outcomes trial is evaluating Rezdiffra for the treatment of compensated MASH cirrhosis, consistent with stage F4C. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, LiverRight will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazin Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazin Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazin Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
This week, our roundtable discussion continues our coverage of the AASLD Emerging Trends Conference. It takes a look at how therapies might evolve over time. Aleksander Krag starts by discussing a presentation on what we can learn from bariatric surgery and goes on to discuss several major medications. The upshot of all this is that we will someday have multiple ways to treat patients and enough knowledge to develop cost-effective, patient-specific pathways. You can't wait for the day, frankly, neither can we. After that, I throw the floor open to questions and comments. Lalos comments on how the presentations he saw on FGF21s in advanced fibrosis and cirrhosis and the SNP analysis from Thursday make him really excited to be able to use this class of drugs when it comes to market. And Jenn Jones asks questions regarding how you slot an ALD patient or a med-ALD patient in a clinical trial given that drinking levels vary week to week, and what might be appropriate clinical endpoints for a cirrhosis trial.
And now, here's Roger and his guests with today's roundtable segment.
So I want to just shift to 2 things. I missed Saturday. Okay, but Saturday and second half of Friday were mostly about effective therapies, if I recall correctly, from the agenda. Who would like to comment a little bit on what they heard in that meeting that they found that element that they found interesting or exciting or novel?
No, I can do that. Yeah, I think there was a lot of very important takeaways. One talk, there were several great talks, actually, all of them, but it was interesting, the surgeon talking about bariatric surgery. And I think we've been very successful with GLP-1s, and we all come to like them because they solve a lot of things at the same time. But the math he did, at least in a US-based system, was that this is not a bad treatment. And what scared many of us in the past was some of these things where we end up with short bowel syndrome and all kinds of issues. But it's not so bad anymore. And actually also this is more or less in the right patient, a one-for-all solution. And economically, it's actually compared to the long-term, at least with the current cost of GLP-1 based or incretin-based therapy, is not a bad thing. So that, I think, was also important takeaway way that we should not just stare blind on these amazing drugs, because there might be patients where this is a very good option. Still GLP-1s are effective. But many patients, they do have side effects. Even we titrate very carefully. They do have change in whatever the perception of food or whatever, and so they don't want it. And that's where we should definitely, I think, be aware that this is still an option. I think that was definitely a great talk. And then there was the talks you already mentioned a little bit, the inspiration there from Ray and the others, how to do it actually, how to implement it in clinical practice. Now we're not in a US-based system, but I think again was inspiring to see how do you go home and make a business model so you can actually, how can you actually do this? And also I think it was inspired to see that, okay, we have these breakthroughs now in these trials, but what about combination? What would the future look like? Marinella did a great talk there. See, okay, these different drugs do different things. Now we are a little bit of a single drug level, but what are we looking into in the future? And it's an extension of our genetic discussion, but FGF21s, GLP-1s, GIPs, glucagon agonists, various different things. And that's again, are we looking into a landscape where we will have, and I think that would be beautiful, in a number of years, several drugs on the shelf, just like we have for hypertension today or diabetes. And then you say, okay, we start with whatever cheapest, most effective, whatever is reimbursed, and then you sort of build up in a system and then treat to target. And I think that would be a dream scenario. And then opening also to see now the 2 phase 2 trials going for alcohol-related liver disease, which is important. And the first was really important discussion there was, should we make clinical trials on MASLD alone or not? And most likely not, because of the arguments I put forward earlier. It simply does not make sense from a drug development perspective because patients are moved. So either you lump them together with ALD trials, what's happening now. So you basically take patients who drink moderate to higher, or you try to expand from the MASLD trials into the MASLD space. And the great thing for this clinicians or patient is that if you have a drug that covers the full spectrum, it will be much easier to implement and use for us, and not suddenly like that. Then you have a pet or something popping up, and then you cannot reimburse them anymore because they don't fit it. So that would be, I think, was a good discussion, and I hope there was a lot of companies in the room also who heard this discussion and will take it with them.
When you get down to the drugs, as Alexander mentioned a little bit, the FGF21 to me is very interesting, just because we don't really have at this point. I get a lot of referrals for people who have basically cirrhosis, maybe not decompensated, not portal hypertension, but who have metabolic steatotic liver disease, and resmetirom and the GLPs probably not having been studied or not have published data on it. But that effect on the F4 patients, I thought was very, very interesting. And that's really these people who have a little bit higher KPA values exceeding 20, where you're not going to use resmetirom, giving an opportunity potentially there. I guess that's maybe 2 years away, a year and a half away, 2 years away. I was very excited about that. I think that's good news.
I have a question. Truth be told, I didn't go Saturday morning. I slept in a little bit, but I did come in the afternoon, where we had some really good discussions about clinical trials and MASLD. And one thing that I didn't bring up during the conference, but has been on my mind, we keep on talking about, okay, people's drinking levels go up and down and up and down. How are we going to put them in a clinical trial? How are we going to study them? What about the people like me, for example, who have been sober for a year plus? Why aren't we looking at maybe this group of people who may have cardiometabolic factors, are also have a high BMI, but they have been sober for 1 year plus? So you actually have a baseline there that doesn't change. So you don't have that variable, and look there first, and then extend the trials to other people that may be drinking. That to me would be a safer way of going about doing a clinical trial to start with. Just to come up with something that may work.
No, that was also part of the discussion. If the drug developers dare to do that, basically they could do an extra arm or add whatever 100 or 200 extra patients like you. But of course, the risk, when you are lean and you don't drink anymore, your risk of progression is low. And what you're looking for in clinical trial is endpoints. It's not good for the patients, but it's the only way to prove a drug actually works, that there are more endpoints in the placebo arm than in the intervention arm. So that's, again, a little bit the barrier. And that's back to where we need some kind of consensus sooner or later. How do we control for alcohol historically, and how does that fit into the different subcategories, and how do we monitor it going forward in clinical trials of both pure MASH, MASLD, and med-ALD, ALD, and how do we, and that's again something where also the agency, FDA or EMA, are not really clear yet, because we haven't seen any trials. So there's no clear guidance on what should a trial in this spectrum look like. What we all want to get away from is the nightmare we've had in the MASH field, and that's the biopsies and the balloon cells that sort of messed it all up more or less and has not helped us. So everybody wants to go to a position where we can do it a non-invasive test. This is how it's going to be driven in clinical practice anyway. But of course, it needs to be this engagement with the drug developer that we help educate them. We help to bring the research base that actually sell that it's actually a good and safe, probably much better idea, and easier to conduct the trials.
Can I ask a second question on that? Just kind of a challenge on you to that is, with the endpoints, couldn't you look at the reduction in fibrosis, for example, if somebody has cirrhosis? Could that be an endpoint? Could an endpoint be a reduction in steatosis for somebody with met-ALD? Could an endpoint be helping a cardio risk factor? It doesn't necessarily, an endpoint doesn't have to necessarily be stopping drinking or reducing drinking, because this person already has. But, I have a lot of people in my community, I just have to say, that are abstinent and they didn't get access to a liver transplant because their MELD score went down. And however, they're looking for a treatment. They're looking for a treatment for their cirrhosis, because having compensated cirrhosis does not give you warm fuzzies. It still doesn't make you feel good every day. You're still going in for scans. There's a lot of things that you do, and you're not going to get a transplant unless you get sicker. So I get asked by my community, so what's out there for me? And so that's my challenge point.
Yeah, no, it's been discussed, and actually we're working with EASL and AASLD together actually on defining these endpoints to have a consensus in the liver community, because nobody knows. I could talk a long time, but basically you separate between phase 2 and phase 3 trial. Phase 3 trial has to be clinical endpoint, otherwise you're not approved, since we don't have these high-level surrogate endpoints. And then you can see what you separate ALD from non-ALD. Would you go for non-invasive or invasive? But basically, you need to have an endpoint that is reasonably likely to or have a clinical endpoint. And you're right, reversing from cirrhosis to whatever F3 or something, or a decrease in non-invasive tests like transient elastography, ELF test, would convince me. But I'm not the problem here. The problem is the regulators. And afterwards, the reimbursement system. Do they actually buy that this is a good one? And that's the problem. We cannot develop strong surrogate markers if we don't have effective drugs. Because that's the only way you can see, okay, if this patient improved with less endpoints, okay, markers also drop. Okay, then it's convincing. But if that's not proven, it's impossible to have this high level of surrogate endpoints.
With that in mind, one of the questions I heard a few times floating around on Thursday and Friday was whether you actually should be doing drug trials in med-ALD or not.
So again, I'm passionate about this, so you should, but you should not do it in isolation. My key point the last thing I said at the meeting was, my key takeaway is that while med-ALD is operational, it makes sense from a conceptual perspective. In a clinical trial setting, it cannot be seen in isolation, just like in clinical practice. So it sort of bridges alcohol as a lead driver versus metabolic as a lead driver, but you cannot see it in isolation for the reason I put forward. And also mean that trials, in my view, would be a mistake to try to do trials just doing med-ALD and not capturing. Because also just the 20 or 30 grams that is allowed in MASLD and MASH is harmful drinking, that's for sure. These people, if you have a BMI of plus 30, you drink 3 units a day, a guy like me, that has a huge impact. And if you stop drinking, it will have a huge impact. So it's again, we need categories to act. That's the way human brain works. Biology and our life is working more as a continuous variable. And that's why it should not be, in my view, it would be a mistake to try to force this into a specific category for clinical trials, or for that sake, clinical management.
That's where I was by the time I left on Friday. That if we can't agree on a definition of med-ALD, it's kind of hard to do a clinical trial on med-ALD.
On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Liver Right, and Tawas in Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please Please join us again next week when we conclude our roundtable on the Emerging Trends Conference, while our newsmakers and experts explore current issues and major ideas.
And until next week, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you on podcast. Bye-bye now.